non-kinetic courses in the Department of War Studies at King's, where Bill and I both teach together. I thought I'd better say something about the kinds of sources that you might want to consult. I only have half an hour or so, and Bill kindly in his course, Body, Mind and Spirit, a study of the First World War, allows me 2 2-hour seminars. So in half an hour I've got to try and put everything together as best I can, but obviously I will be leaving out huge chunks of the kind of analysis that I try to employ at King's. But these are some of the texts which I find most helpful. They're all, in a sense, revisionist texts. That is to say, they take a different view about the First World War, about the trench warfare in particular in the First World War, and that view contrasts with the orthodox conventional view, which I'll say more about in a moment. But just to give you some idea of these books and their contents, Brian Bond, 2 books, Survivors of a Kind and The Unquiet Western Front. Brian Bond might be described, I don't know whether Bill would agree, as the godfather of this young, well not so young now, young school of revisionist historians who take a rather different view from the one that has been promulgated in the past. And he was instrumental in training this school and influencing their thinking. Todman is a very interesting writer. He's talking about the Great War in terms of the myths, as he argues, that were created by earlier interpretations, particularly the interpretations of the poets. And it's a very detailed, very thorough study, very well written, certainly worth reading. Now, here is an interesting fellow, Stevenson. I came across him quite by accident, reading a review, and I bought his book and read it with interest. He is professor of, I think, English literature at the University of Edinburgh. And he's one of the few literary scholars of literature, who acknowledges that there is some kind of debate going on between historians and the old traditional view, which of course was reinforced by the poetry produced by the great poets of that period. So he's interesting because he has engaged with the debate, and he really ought to be given more publicity for the work he does. And finally, Gary Sheffield, Forgotten Victory, he too is a historian worth reading, because he too has questioned some of the basic assumptions which underpin our thinking about the First World War. Now, when I gave my title to Athena, I thought of a subtitle subsequently, which was Poetry in World War I, True, False, or Simply Misleading. And I haven't really made up my mind completely about the answer to that question. I think if you were to come to the Department of War Studies and visit Bill and I on the 7th floor and the 6th floor, as you come in from the lift from the 6th floor, you will see a collection of rather fine, somewhat gruesome paintings. There's a Paul Nash showing a bleak landscape of no man's land. There's a Stanley Spencer demonstrating the bringing of wounded to a casualty station in World War I, and there are various others. And the really interesting question I think we have to ask is, how does one make a judgment about that kind of image, that kind of picture, that kind of interpretation of World War I, demonstrating in the poetry in many cases, in painting, in novels, in films, BBC television programs, Blackadder, etc., etc. How does one measure that interpretation? How does one rate it? I think sometimes that really to do justice to this kind of topic, one needs to be a scholar of literature. One needs to be a specialist, if you like, in aesthetics, a sociologist, and bringing up the rear, as always, you have to be an historian. And all I can do in this brief half hour is offer you some commentary, some personal reflections on the subject, trying to analyse the way in which poets like Owen, Sassoon and Isaac Rosenberg, to take just three, and there were very many others, but taking those three, how it is that those three did so much to describe in very vivid language what they regarded as the horrors of trench warfare. I must say, in thinking about this issue, thinking about this problem over the last few years, I picked up anthologies, one I remember called The Lost Poets of World War I. You know, I mean, poetry was an astonishing outlet for people serving in France and Belgium during the First World War. And you will find, you know, a huge range of experience expressed in that poetry. But of course, we've tended over the years to concentrate on the great names, the Owens, the Sassoons, Isaac Rosenberg. And the questions that are posed, I think, are very difficult to answer. I'm not sure that I have an answer. You know, is there interpretation? Is the interpretation in poetic terms accurate, entirely accurate? Does it reflect a universal experience common to all those who fought on the Western Front? How do we explain the tenacious grip on the minds of many generations since 1918? How do we explain that tenacious grip of those poets on our thinking about the First World War? These are difficult questions, hard questions, and I can't say I can give you a real answer to them, but I think it's important at least to try and offer an answer. Todman, in his book, makes great play of the argument that one's reaction to the First World War and to the literature that the First World War spawned, particularly the great names in literature and painting for that matter, and subsequently in novels and so on. Todman makes the point that how you react to that kind of literature, that kind of experience, the experience of trench warfare in particular. And Bill is quite right, there's a lot more to the First World War than trench warfare, but the abiding image, Blackadder, going over the top in that very last episode, brilliant stuff. You know, it's a great piece of television making, very moving, and yet how do you react to it? And I suspect that Todman is right when he says that ultimately you react according to your own personal circumstances, the way you grew up, the way you were educated, and to some extent it depends, of course, on the circumstances, the values, the culture of the society in which you are living at the time. And that different generations over the years have interpreted the First World War in different ways. But the dominant narrative clearly has been the one expressed by the First World War poets. Now let me be anecdotal and just give you some indication of where I am coming from, if you like, personally and intellectually. As Athena has said, I'm a South African by birth, although I've lived in this country for many years and worked here for many years. I have a kind of background which really supports Todman's point. This really gives the game away as far as my age is concerned. My father was a small boy in the siege of Kimberley during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899-1902. My mother, coincidentally, was in the siege of Mafeking in the same war. My father was sent to Imperial College in July 1914, because he was a clever lad, and the idea was that he would get a good degree at Imperial College and come back and be a mining engineer. My grandfather had been sent out to South Africa, or he'd gone out voluntarily, because he got fed up being a coal miner, and ended up in Cecil Rhodes's compound manager on the Kimberley diamond fields. My father ends up in July 1914 in England. The war breaks out. What a good idea, he says. Let's go and join the colours and see what it's all about. How exciting. And off he goes, and survives 5 years in the Royal Horse Artillery, bombarding the Germans. He then, in the Second World War, joins the South African Engineers and goes through that campaign as well, building aerodromes right across southern and central Africa. Now, the interesting thing about that, and that conditioned my experience, you see, was that he would never talk about the war, never discuss it. And I would press him as a small boy. I would say, well, what was it like? What were you doing? Because he bought all those wonderful pictorial histories of the First World War with those brown photographs, you know, of all the great campaigns. And I, as a child, you know, read them. I could never pronounce the names of the French battlefields, but I had a go at it. I'm still pretty bad, I think, at pronouncing them. But, you know, he would never talk about the war. And to some extent, the fact that I was surrounded by books, at least, about the First World War, conditioned my subsequent response. And of course, I suppose what really happened later was that I did a degree in English and History at the University in Johannesburg. We were exposed, as you might expect, to the war poets. I came to Britain and started teaching strategic studies all those years ago at the University of Wales at Swansea, when strategic studies was beginning to blossom. Deterrence theory was a kind of new variety of theology, but there it is. I mean, the same kind of incredible detail, logic, etc., attached to it. And there I was teaching strategic studies in the 1960s. What did I have to go on as far as books were concerned? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that in the 1960s there was an outpouring of books on the First World War. It was 1964, the 50th anniversary. And so there were books by people like Alan Clark, Lions Led by Donkeys, his famous study of the generals, highly critical. There were people like what was his name?
A.W.J.
Yeah.
Little Hop.
Yeah, and Leon Wolfe and others, Middlebrook and so forth. And they were all, of course, profoundly critical of the way in which the First World War had been fought, profoundly critical of the generals, and took the view that the World War I was simply an exercise in futility. And of course they were influenced by their environment, by the culture of their society at that time, because the Vietnam War was on, and television programs, books of this kind, discussions of the poets, were all in a sense designed to try and impress upon people the horror of war and the need to avoid it. And the Vietnam War, in a curious kind of way, I think, reinforced that view. There were exceptions to that interpretation. John Terraine, a very great historian, began to question the orthodoxy on the wickedness of the generals and their lack of intellectual understanding of what they were about. And his Life of Haig is still, I think, a major work of substance. So you can see the argument, you can see the pattern shifting. But what this demonstrates, I think, is that one is a child, if you like, of one's time in terms of one's attitude to great events like the First World War. And again, in my teaching then, you know, I had a very simple explanation of the First World War. And the poets reinforced this. That was again where the narrative partly largely came from. You know, that after all, in 1914, when the great powers went to war with each other, they were all industrialized, more or less. they had huge resources of weaponry. They were ideological in the sense that they were all nationalist at heart. They could rally people to fight and go to the colours. And they had the great advantage of technology, which was a product of industrialization. They could move hundreds, thousands of people across large areas of territory, partly because they used the railway system with such effect. I mean, the German or the Prussian General Staff, and I think subsequently the German General Staff, had a special section devoted entirely to railway timetables. On the American principle, the Great Civil War general principle, you know, getting there fastest with the mostest, getting there fastest with the mostest. And, you know, in that sense, that technology plus ideology plus the third element in the equation, which was bureaucracy. In other words, you had, in all these countries, a civil service, able, willing to carry out its political master's wishes, and capable of implementing, designing and then implementing a war effort on a very efficient basis, as Bill, I think, has described. So, in 1914, you had these five great powers clashing with each other, and I suspect that most people didn't expect the war to be the kind of war that it became. It's fair to say, I suppose, that politicians and generals, when they think about the next war, are usually thinking in terms of planning based on the last war, and that may well have been the case in 1914. So, my theory when I was teaching the young all those years ago in Wales was that the two defining moments of the 20th century was the First World War, trench warfare, and the Holocaust. I saw a connection between these two. I took the view that that if you look at the experience of men, especially through the poetry, the great poets, if you look at the experience of men and women in the trenches in the First World War, and the experience of that Jewish community who were butchered by the Nazis in concentration camps, you can see, and this is a very simple-minded view, I grant you can see certain similarities. For one thing, you could argue that those who were stuck in the trenches and those who were going through the horror of the concentration camps must have felt that they were at the mercy of forces over which they had no control. You know, what could they do to change their position, dreadful and awful as it was? Secondly, they must have felt that you know, there was no end in sight. When would this awful experience end? And thirdly, of course, they were, in both cases, at the mercy of those three great 19th, 20th century developments: ideology, technology, bureaucracy. You know, Eichmann moved the trains back and forth to the concentration camps. Well, I thought that was a pretty interesting comparison to make, and it had some merit. It simulated argument with students and so forth and so on. But I have to say that Professor Philpott here and I used to have some friendly discussions occasionally over dinner, and he convinced me that one ought really to be careful about analogies of that kind, that they perhaps are too forced and too simple, that they oversimplify the situation. And I had to accept that, and so I tended to modify my view and would not really want to press the comparison I'd made, except in certain respects. Now, you see, there's a lovely article by Toby Young, I think in the Telegraph, about a month or so ago, where he says, you know, for the next 4 years we are going to have conferences where the literary critics are going to be fighting, arguing, glowering at their historian colleagues, because that debate about the poetic interpretation of the war is still going on. I hope that's not the case. I would hope that in the 5 years or 4 years that lie ahead for commemorating the First World War, that some attempt will be made to reconcile the different views that historians have come up with on the origins of the war, and secondly, the view that the poets express. You see, the difficulty with poetry of the sort that we're talking about, and I think some poems have been circulated to you, and most of you must be familiar with that poetry. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things I find is that for decades, well, for years at least, school children going through the English educational system are now exposed automatically to the poets of the First World War. And this is seen as the defining narrative of what happened. They're taught by teachers of English to take that view. Whether they have history teachers who challenge that view, I don't know. I don't know enough about the English educational system. But what I find extraordinary is that our Minister of Culture has decided, in her wisdom, backed no doubt by the Prime Minister, that over the next year or so, parties, hundreds of school children will be sent off to the battlefields of the First World War to get some sense of what it was about, what it was like. Now, no one can object to that, and I certainly don't object to that. But how do you get across and interpret a different interpretation? How do you suggest that the poetry isn't necessarily universally, how can I put it, a universal explanation of human experience throughout those 5 years? The problem is that the language these poets use, and you've had a look at them, I hope, the language these poets use is so seductive. It's so precise, so clear, so moving. How can you not be moved by Wilfred Owen's Strange Meeting, that wonderful poem, which incidentally, as far as I remember, reading Sebastian Falk's book, Birdsong, the last part of Birdsong, I think, is based clearly on Wilfred Owen's poem Strange Meeting. I mean, extraordinary that the influence of that poem, written all those years ago, that the influence of that poem on a major English novelist, you can see the connection if you trace it through very carefully. Now, you all know the history of poetic experience during the First World War. You know, the early poems by Rupert Brooke, the early poems by Julian Grenfell. There are a host of young men writing poems, dashing off to the First World War. Grenfell's poem Into Battle, I won't try and read the whole thing, I think you've seen, some of you have the copy, where he says, the naked earth is warm with spring, and with green grass and bursting trees, and life is colour and warmth and light, and a striving evermore for these. And he is dead who will not fight, and who dies fighting has increase. You know, that's an extraordinary, to us now, that's an extraordinary explanation of the pleasure, the intense pleasure that a young man like Grenfell, and there were many like him, well-educated public school boys who went off to the First World War and were killed very quickly in the most horrific circumstances. So you get the transition from that rather extraordinary enthusiasm expressed in verse, expressed in novels like Tell England by Ernest Raymond. You get the transition from that to the poems of Owen, Sassoon, and Rosenberg. And again, you've got this problem. I mean, they are so seductive. They grab the mind, the imagination, they move the emotions, and you say, well, of course, that's what it was like. But it wasn't. And historians and others have demonstrated that this isn't the case. The best example I can give you, and again, I can't go through all the examples, I've got plenty if you press me. Sheffield's book and Todman's book, and Bond's book, that book there at the top, Survivors of a Kind, that's a remarkable book. Because what has he done? I mean, he's a very fine experience. What Bond did in that book, which wasn't widely noticed as far as I recall. I was lucky, I read a review of it in The Spectator and bought it immediately because I thought this is really saying something which is very new and different. What he's done is to go through the memoirs of a pretty representative group of people who fought in the First World War, either in the ranks, working class lads, etc., or middle class people who joined the colours and survived and went through it. The book is called Survivors of a Kind. And you see, what emerges, and I won't quote all the chapters that are in that book, you have to read it for yourselves, but what emerges is for quite a lot of people, the war was an enjoyable experience. You know, it was the making of them. They admitted this themselves in their diaries, in their letters. They regarded that 5 years where they were survivors of a kind as being profoundly different and more exciting than anything they'd known before and anything that subsequently came after. And they stressed, for example, all these chapters, all these people who Bond in his book, Survivors of a Kind, quotes, they stressed that what mattered was the sense of comradeship, their sense of belonging to a group, of adapting, of coping as best they could, of having a sense of humour in the most appalling circumstances, of editing newspapers, for God's sake, like the Viper's Times, you know. Extraordinary. There's a new book out on that recently, which is extremely interesting, how they actually produced a newspaper for the trenches in the middle of the war. And what Bond has tried to do is to show that the experience of trench warfare, I'm sorry to bang on about trench warfare, but it's the one thing that's always interested me. What Bond demonstrates, I think, in that book of his, Survivors of a Kind, is the wide variety of experience that men and women enjoy. They accept and admit, and Bond himself admits, you know, that there were moments, more than moments of horror, devastation, death and destruction, yes. And yet somehow, those who fight and go through it all and somehow survive are not just passive sufferers. They're not passive sufferers. They're reacting, they're trying to cope, they're resilient, they're finding ways and means of sorting themselves out. So, what can I say? You know, why is it that the poetic interpretation is so compelling, so seductive, gets such a grip on our minds? I'm not trying to denigrate the poems. I still think they are profoundly moving. They tell us something about the experience of some people in that particular conflict. But the notion that it was a universally valid explanation, interpretation of that experience, seems to me to be a mistaken one. I can't say more than that. I mean, I could read examples, but you've had some of those examples, and most of you, I suspect, are at least familiar with some of the poems. One of my favourites, just to give you a sample, is the one by Rosenberg, where he talks about the queer sardonic rat. I mean, that's a wonderful poem. And that shows a kind of irony, a kind of humour, you know, which is unusual. So have a look at that, because it's I wish I could find my own copy somewhere here, but it's a fine poem by any standards. I'll see if I can quickly look through all this stuff. I mean, Owen's stuff is again very, very moving. It's precise. The language is exact. You know, and yet we're told that Owen wrote a lot of his poems when he was on leave or in hospital where he was sent, you know, to sort himself out. under the great psychologist Rivers, that Owen wrote a fair amount of his stuff, not on the front line, but, as Wordsworth would have said, he was writing poetry as recollection in tranquility. Recollection in tranquility. Wordsworth's phrase, I think, sums that up very well. Where else? I can't find it for the moment, it doesn't matter. The other point I wanted to make, just before I conclude, was that, and here I think I disagree with Todman. Todman says that, by and large, the poetry that emerged, or the experience of World War I, did not fundamentally reshape the scope and substance of literature thereafter. I'm talking here about English literature, believe me, because I don't know much about the rest. I'm not sure that he's right. I'm not sure that he's right. It seems to me that if you read the poetry of the moderns after World War I, particularly if you read Eliot and Auden, you know, there's a kind of recollection there of the impact of that war on their thinking, on their behaviour, and on their writing. The Wasteland, you know, is called the Wasteland, I suspect, because Eliot felt he was living in a post-war wasteland. That's a personal view, I may be quite wrong about it. So, just bear that in mind. The last point I'll make, and I'm sorry this has been a little haphazard, but inevitably it's bound to be given the time constraint. The last point I'll make is that it's worth looking at some of the poetry written during the Second World War. Because although, again, the poetic experience varies enormously, there are one or two writers who I think do stand out, and who stand out in sharp contrast to their 1914, 1918 counterparts. I'm thinking in particular of, what's his name, where can I find it? Sorry to delay here, and I will find it eventually. Yes. Two poems, one half of which I think you've got, called All Day It Has Rained, by Alan Lewis, who again was killed during the Second World War. Now the sad thing is that in circulating this to you, we forgot to give you the last verse, sort of on the back of this, but you can find it in any decent anthology. But the poem that I want to just end with, because I think one needs a note of optimism here, is the great trilogy by Henry Reed, Lessons of the War. I think that's the best poem that's come out of the Second World War, and it's in sharp contrast to the Owens, Sassoons and Rosenbergs. The three poems, and I won't read them all because they'll take a little time to do so. One is called Naming of Parts. It starts in the most wonderful way. Today we have naming of parts. Yesterday we had daily cleaning. And tomorrow morning we should have what to do after firing. But today we have naming of parts. Japonica glistens like coral in all of the neighbouring gardens. And today we have naming of parts. This is the lower swing civil. And this is the upper swing civil, whose use you will see when you are given your slings. And this is the piling swivel, which in your case you have not got. The branches hold in the gardens their silent, eloquent gestures, which in our case we have not got. It's this wonderful contrast between the sergeant drilling this bunch of recruits and saying, here's your rifle and these are the parts and this is how they work. And nature going on in its own sweet way, paying no attention to what's happening around. The second poem, called Judging Distances, is hilarious, really. He says, not only how far away, but the way that you say it is very important. Perhaps you may never get the knack of judging at distance, but at least you know how to report on the landscape, the central sector, the right of arc, and that which we had last Tuesday. And at least you know that maps are of time, not place. So as far as the army happens to be concerned, the reason being is one which need not delay us, again you know there are only 3 kinds of tree, 3 only, the fir and the poplar, and those which have bushy tops, and lastly, that things only seem to be things. A barn is not called a barn, to put it more plainly, or a field in the distance where sheep may be safely grazing. You must never be oversure. You must say when reporting, at 5 o'clock in the central sector is a dozen of what appear to be animals. Whatever you do, don't call the bleeders sheep. And so it goes. I mean, it's a wonderful poem, judging distances, teaching people, young recruits, how to read a map. But the best of them is the last one, unarmed combat. Because here there's a sense that Reed felt, and most people felt, I suspect, on the western side certainly, and elsewhere presumably, that the war was worth fighting. World War II was worth fighting. I'll just give you this last poem as a conclusion. In due course, of course, you will all be issued with your proper issue. But until tomorrow, you can hardly be said to need it. And until that time, we shall have unarmed combat. I shall teach you the various holes and rolls and throws and breakfalls which you may sometimes meet. And the various holes and rolls and throws and breakfalls do not depend on any sort of weapon, but only on what I might coin a phrase and call the ever-important question of human balance and the ever-important need to be in a strong position at the start. There are many kinds of weakness about the body, where you would least expect, like the ball of the foot. But the various holes and rolls and throws and breakfalls will always come in useful, and never be frightened to tackle from behind. It may not be clean to do so, but this is global war. So give them all you have, and always give them as good as you get. It will get you somewhere. You may not know it, but you can tie a jerry up without rope. It is one of the things I shall teach you. Nothing will matter if only you are ready for him. The readiness is all. And he goes on, the readiness is all. How can I help but feel? I have been here before. But somehow then, I was the tied up one. How to get out was always my problem. And even if I had a piece of rope, I was always the sort of person who threw the rope aside. And in my time, I have given them all I had, which was never as good as I got, and it got me nowhere. And the various holes and rolls and throws and breakfalls, somehow or other, I always seemed to put in the wrong place. And as for war, my wars were global from the start. Perhaps I was never in the strong position on the ball of my foot got hurt, or I had some weakness where I least expected. But I think I see your point. While awaiting a proper issue, we must learn the lesson of the important question of human balance. It is courage that counts. And this is where he ends on this wonderful note of hope. This is in the middle of a war. Things may be the same again, and we must fight not in the hope of winning, but rather of keeping something alive, so that when we meet our end, it may be said that we tackled wherever we could, that battle fit we lived, and though defeated, not without glory fought. Well, that's a sharp contrast, isn't it, to Owen Sassoon Rosenberg. And again, going back to Todman, I suppose one would have to say, again, it depends on the circumstances in which you find yourself, how you interpret the war in which you're involved, or the wars in which you have been involved in the past, and the wars that might come in the future. Anyway, all I can say is I hope I've given you enough to encourage you to go away and read some more war poetry, and perhaps even write the odd dissertation on the subject. But that's for someone else to decide. Thank you so much for your attention.